Should we mute and turn off our videos then?
Yeah, mute if you're not presenting, yes. Welcome to CrimCon. We're here on stream 4, where we are presenting a panel communicating what works. We have a few panels that that deal with this topic throughout the conference, so seek those out in the program. Here, real quick, right off the top, how this is going to work. We'll proceed in the order of the program. I happen to be the first presenter on this panel. And each presenter will have 10 minutes to give their presentation. If you have questions, click the Q&A button down at the bottom, type your question in. You can do that at any time. We will answer those questions at the end after everybody has presented. So with that, we will get started here. And by we, I suppose I mean me. Oh, goodness. All right. There it is. Okay. Hi. My name is Troy Payne. I'm the director of the Alaska Justice Information Center, and I am a faculty member at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. I'll be talking to you today about dynamic data visualizations for translational research. I should note right off the top that most of what I'm going to show you today, I didn't actually make. I have the privilege of having staff members who know more about how to do this than I do. And they've produced a number of really great visualizations for us. Our research professionals, Andrew, Avi, and Yevgenii, have been fantastic. The other thing that I'd like to acknowledge is that funding for this project was provided by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. This was a capacity building grant for the Alaska Justice Information Center, which is Alaska's Statistical Analysis Center. Now, I'm going to be showing you a few dashboards. In the interest of time, I'm going to be showing you static images, but you can play with these dashboards yourself. You can get to them by going to uaa.alaska.edu/agic/dashboards. I promise you that is the shortest URL that I can make in the university's website. So if you want to take a look at these, you can go to uaa.alaska.edu/agic/dashboards. Now, one of the things that is often overlooked, particularly if you've got graduate education, are descriptive statistics. We often underrate descriptive statistics as a tool for understanding our data. And if you look in a lot of top tier journal articles, and some of them really aren't even reporting descriptive statistics anymore. So it's kind of it's actually kind of shocking how frequently that gets missed. So what we have here is motor vehicle theft in Alaska. What you're looking at is the count. Users in this dashboard can actually select whether they're looking at counts or rates. What we found in AGIC is that every time that we go and do a presentation and we show counts, somebody wants rates. If we show rates, somebody wants counts. And so we've produced this dashboard that lets people choose both. In this case, it doesn't change the shape of the graph at all. Eagle-eyed viewers in the audience will notice that there is a massive increase at roughly 2014 or so, and that's real. That's not a data error, and there's some consternation about what caused that. We're actually not quite sure. Descriptive statistics are an underrated tool for understanding crime. We don't think about them very much, particularly as academics, but this is a really effective way of showing what's been going on. This is better than looking at just UCR stats that look at this year compared to last year or 3-year trends, because we've got this really long data series. So you can see the ups and downs of it. Now, I've said a couple of times the term dashboard. When I say dashboard, all I'm talking about is a chart with some words around it. Our dashboards in AGIC tend to be a little bit text heavy. That's because our user testing found that some instructions were necessary with our target audience. Show you another, maybe. There we go. This is the Alaska Department of Corrections daily inmate population dashboard. There's an awful lot going on here. This is one of the text-heavy dashboards that we have, but we need this explanatory text so that the data can be fully contextualized. You can see at a glance what DOC's maximum capacity is. You can kind of eyeball how close we are to meeting that maximum capacity. You can get a good sense of the mix of sentenced and unsentenced populations in Alaska DOC. Alaska's DOC is an integrated jail and prison system. So they have both pretrial detainees and post-conviction incarcerated persons. And the panel on the right shows a change in inmate population since the beginning of the data. This is a dashboard that shows daily data. And if you load the live dashboard, as you hover over that area chart, there is a tooltip that gives you even more information. There's also another tab to this dashboard that will show you each institution. So if you're curious about a specific correctional institution in Alaska's Department of Corrections, you can look at the daily population there. We update this monthly. We actually get the data daily from DOC, but we do some error checking and other cleaning steps that cause us to lag the data by a month. Here is another dashboard. This one, it was done in partnership with Alaska's Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault with funding from the US DOJ Office for Victims of Crime. This visualizes results from the Alaska Victimization Survey. The Alaska Victimization Survey is patterned after NSVIS. It is a survey of English-speaking Alaska females about intimate partner violence, sexual assault, stalking behaviors. What makes this dashboard particularly important in our context is that Alaska's rates of intimate partner violence and sexual assault are the highest in the country, first of all. And secondly, we partnered with CDVSA and their service providers to produce this dashboard that has information that's relevant to them and to their service provision. The elements that are on this dashboard are here because when we talked with CDVSA and their service providers, this is what they wanted to know. The Alaska University of Alaska Justice Center has been running the Alaska Victimization Survey for about 10 years. And this is the first time that comprehensive statistics have been available to service providers. Service providers can select the race, age, and income bracket on this particular dashboard. There are a number of different tabs to this one. This is a quite complex dashboard that we're still working on. You get at a glance the number of respondents who reported one or more forms of intimate partner violence. And again, at a glance, you can get a good idea of the mix of that. All of these elements, everything on this page is dynamic. It all changes when you select a different race or different age or different income bracket. So readers can get what they need out of this chart. Got another one. In addition to my faculty role and my role as director of the Alaska Justice Information Center, I'm also the secretary and treasurer for CrimCon 2020. And part of my role as that has been to handle the whole technical back end for this conference. It's been a wild ride, let me tell you. Well, after yesterday's sessions ended, we pulled analytics out of Zoom's backend and created this dashboard. And when I say we, I mean Andrew Gonzalez from our team did this. This dashboard is available to you at crimcon.org/stats. And from here, you can select a day or a stream or a session time, and you can see the number of unique visitors and how many different countries people attended from. Now, we could have done a lot of other things with this. We were running pretty late in the day, so we decided to do the sort of like quickest, most visually whiz-bang thing that we could get together. We're going to be updating this with more information. So today's sessions will be added to this at the end of today, and Friday sessions will be added at the end of Friday. So you'll be able to see the viewer stats from each day stream session. Again, all of it is dynamic. You can get here to this from crimcon.org/stats. So why would we do this? Why would we go to this sort of trouble? You can increase the reach of your work and engagement with your work. You can keep your analysis products up to date so they stay relevant. You know, as people start playing around with these things, they really look at it. You know, if you're interested in just one age group or one race group, and you start playing around with this, people spend more time with it than they will with a static chart. That's the good of it. The bad of it is that creating these kinds of dashboards requires both analytic and artistic skills. Your existing skills may be insufficient. We've spent a year training up our staff in the Alaska Justice Information Center with funding from the Bureau of Justice Statistics to be able to get to where we are today. There's a number of technical hurdles and other sorts of problems that you can run into with these, and not all projects benefit from a dashboard. You really have to think about your dissemination strategy, who your audience is, and what they need to know if running a dashboard is a good idea. That's the 10-minute version of this talk. I have a lot more to say about this topic, but I am 40 seconds over time. You can go to uaa.alaska.edu/AGIC/dashboards. There's also a publications page there that has a style guide that we've created. For the CrimCon stats, you can go to crimcon.org/stats. If you have questions, get in touch with me. I am super available and easily Googleable. Thanks. Okay, so that's me. Next up on our agenda is considering criminological uncertainty, the challenge of scientific communication within evidence-based policing.
All right, so should I just jump in?
Just jump in.
All right, let's see if I can make share screen work. Yeah, here we go. All right, can you see that?
We can.
Perfect. So my name is Chris Giacomantonio. I'm here representing a group of my colleagues from several institutions, talking about some theoretical work we've been doing around the concept of uncertainty in criminological evidence and how that applies specifically to evidence-based policing, although maybe not always uniquely to evidence-based policing. I'm going to be powering through several concepts in what's essentially a working theoretical paper. So if there's anything I brush over too quickly, obviously feel free to ask in questions, and my email address will be at the end of the presentation. In this presentation, I'm first going to go into a bit about why we're interested in this concept of scientific uncertainty or criminological uncertainty, why it matters for knowledge translation in the evidence-based policing field and more broadly in other scientific fields. So we're going to draw on some key concepts and existing evidence from the scientific fields where the idea of uncertainty is better developed, and then consider the specific field of evidence-based policing and some of the terrain that we have to navigate to express and make coherent the idea of uncertainty in in our particular field. And I'll just say that all the people who are authors on this paper work in some form in translational knowledge and evidence-based policing. So either working in police organizations, working with police, or in police education, and trying to make the most of existing criminological evidence to help guide policing practice. And then I'm going to conclude the presentation just by stating what we think is the sort of normative challenge or tension that this problem of uncertainty raises, and what we think is an empirical project that is sort of required to help people navigate this problem of uncertainty. And I'll just say that our goal isn't to solve the problem of uncertainty, but to make it theoretically coherent as people go about developing good, robust evidence around criminological and policing issues. So for us, uncertainty matters primarily because all science is uncertain. So this is part of the world we work in, whether or not we want to admit it. We have to recognize that the science we're working with is always uncertain, and we always have a responsibility to communicate limitations to the evidence base that we're working within. But we also have to be aware that expressing uncertainty may limit the likelihood that evidence-based decision-making takes place. And we think this is a problem in all science, but in criminology, this is very much under-theorized. In evidence-based policing, it's under-theorized. So we see lots of discussion about concepts like what works in evidence-based policing or what works in reducing crime. And we know the nature of evidence, not just social scientific evidence, but perhaps particularly social science evidence. The evidence may not do what people say it can do, and people may underemphasize what's unknown or conversely overemphasize what's unknown, and navigating this uncertainty and then how the messages of uncertainty are digested by policy and decision maker and practitioner audiences is a relative unknown for us. So this all emerged from several conversations we were having about how best to express some evidence-based concepts to practitioner and policy audiences. And it started to occur to us that we really didn't know much about this uncertainty, and this turns out this is an area for development for several scientific fields. Probably best developed in the evidence-based medicine paradigm. So this quote is drawn from a paper on new models of thinking through the problems of evidence-based medicine. And I won't read the quote out loud, but essentially this raises for us the ever-present challenge of the gap between the evidence-based ideal and where we are here and now. We always have incomplete and subject to revision evidence in front of us, and yet decisions need to be made based on this incomplete or contested data. And we think that this is a really good way to ground our ideas about what we can actually expect an evidence-based practice to look like. And that evidence-based practice will be practice guided by the best available, incomplete, contested, and subject to revision data. And we think that that's an important kind of starting point as people go through understanding the problem of uncertainty and how to navigate it. So looking at the wider scientific fields where the communication of scientific uncertainty has been given some greater attention, sort of like climate science, health, education, psychology areas where we've seen some pretty good development here. We know a few things about the expression of scientific uncertainty, and I haven't listed them all here. We're developing a working paper where there's a much greater list, but some of the big ones we thought worth highlighting are first that experts are very reluctant to express uncertainty to decision makers because they fear things like it makes them look imprecise or that they lack confidence in their assertions. We also know that there's recent evidence of a thing called the easiness effect. So that second bullet point, that efforts to translate evidence to non-expert audiences can diminish the audience's valuation of expertise. And so when we work to translate knowledge, create research products for intelligent lay audiences, we may actually be giving those audiences overconfidence in their ability to generate, understand, and work with scientific evidence, and to devalue what experts bring to the table and what scientific expertise really is. But we also know that experts taking knowledge and misinterpreting or overselling the findings can create real credibility problems in several fields. In psychology, so Lewis and Y come from psychology, and they note that there's a current credibility revolution of non-replicability or of findings simply not translating to practice in the way that was expected. And so these are all issues that we need to face, and we think these are all real issues for criminology and for evidence-based policing. And we think there's several additional ones that are worth highlighting. So looking then at the evidence-based policing field, we sort of thought that there's about 4 thematic groupings of the main problems, or the main the sort of the topography of the evidence-based policing field that are, if not necessarily unique, then at least pronounced in the criminological field. And so when we think about evidence-based policing and what uncertainty means there, first we have to accept that criminology is a particularly uncertain field. So it's a young field. It has all kinds of internal epistemological and ontological debates about how knowledge should be generated. But even when we get into the more narrow fields like evidence-based policing, which are based around sort of positivist program evaluation approaches to understanding what works, the evidence that exists, even in the best developed areas, has very limited predictive value when applied to new contexts or when scaled up, such that when we see an intervention work robustly in several locations, we still can't be predictably certain of how it will perform in a new context. We also know that, and again, unlike several scientific fields where most of the policy and decision-making audience may at least accept the need for science, whether or not they contest the evidence, they accept the value of science in the decision-making process. In evidence-based policing, we know that there are listeners who simply see no role for science, don't accept the importance of scientific evidence in decision-making. And even among those who do, we know from several recent studies that receptivity will differ, and most, even those who are receptive to the idea of science in the decision-making process, defer to professional knowledge over the existing science. We also know that even in those situations where scientific evidence has been successfully translated into practice, we don't know what the communication process was. So we don't have an evidence base for what is effective communication, how police leaders, policymakers, practitioners were convinced that the evidence had value and that we could see its translation into practice in a relatively linear fashion. We simply don't know much about that process. And then finally, and related to some points I was making earlier, the evidence is inherently limited. So it's not something that can be overcome with more evidence, although the problem becomes somewhat attenuated. Evidence in social science and criminology is inherently limited. It won't do what some people think it can do, which is provide certainty. It still creates uncertainty in contexts, and the decision-making context in which that uncertainty exists is different from the scientific context in which that evidence is produced. So where does this leave us? Well, first, we think this just creates a normative tension that we need to make clear and coherent, which we're trying to do with our paper and with this idea that we're essentially dealing with competing norms of a responsibility to admit that science is incomplete and a responsibility to guide decisions based on that uncertain science. So we shouldn't just say because it's uncertain, the decision doesn't have to take it into account. We still have to promote science that pushes towards better and away from worse decisions, things we are reasonably sure are likely to be true. And that's the best endpoint we can get to, is things that we're reasonably sure are likely to be true. And so how do we think we can navigate this? What are some higher level principles people can use to address this normative challenge or this tension between norms in science? Well, we think a couple of points are worth highlighting. First, we want to think about what is science good for and what's good for science. So first, in terms of what science is good for, we want to be able to show that the evidence can demonstrate positive change in terms of practice, reducing harm, reducing crime, improving how policing and allied professions are done. But we also have to think about what is for the good of science. So we have to think about, in terms of our claims about what our evidence can do, we also have to make them in a way that retains the credibility of the field, because we will take shots that are ultimately wrong, that ultimately miss the mark, that don't do what we thought they would do, even if the decision was based on the best available science. We also think that we can use the existing evidence while we can't transfer it. I think this problem of policy transfer of a one-to-one, take an intervention that was used here and put it over there, we have to avoid that to a degree. We can take the principles from existing evidence and use them to guide new or scaled up or modified or improved interventions. And some of the principles we see in the evidence-based policing literature that tend to rise to the top as general themes of guiding successful interventions include things like proactivity, problem solving, focus, and fairness. And then, of course, to keep building the evidence through systematic research. So when we try and take these shots, we still have to continue the job of building evidence, knowing that it will be incomplete and retain some level of uncertainty. And then finally, and this is my last slide, hopefully, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but hopefully okay. I think we see an empirical project here. So once we know what message we want to convey, once we've accepted this uncertainty and determined the message we would like practitioners and policymakers to take in, we still have to figure out what the better way to convey that message is that will be heard in the ways we hope it will be heard, that will deliver the information we hope to deliver when crafting our message. And we think this is first an experimental research agenda. There's an empirical question about how different police leaders digest different levels of uncertainty, different phrasings of research evidence and uncertainty in it. And I think that that's kind of our next step, and something we're working on as a team is to try to develop projects that address that empirical gap. So hopefully that makes sense. As I said, my email address is here, or please feel free to ask questions through the Q&A bar, and I'll pass it back to Troy.
Great, thanks. Next, we have Matt Ashby talking about 3/4 of the new criminological knowledge is hidden from policymakers. While he's getting set up, I'll remind everybody that you can hit the Q&A button and type in a question for us. We've already got a couple of questions that we'll get to as we have time. All right, looking good. We can see it.
Okay, shall I start then?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm going to talk about open access to the results of the research that we all produce. So ASC and ACJS both have identical codes of ethics, because one copied from the other one, and they say that that those organizations and that their members should be committed to free and open access to knowledge and to sharing sources of our research findings whenever possible. And we, of course, as academics, have great access to research because our libraries pay subscriptions so that we can get access to journals. But there are lots of other people who would benefit from having access to our work who aren't necessarily as lucky. So if we think about someone like Priya, imagine Priya is a PhD student at university in India. She needs access to crim research because that's what she's doing. She needs it just as much as we do, but her university doesn't have the funding to to subscribe to the 100+ journals that crim research is published in, and so she is locked out of a lot of the knowledge that we take for granted. Same with Juan Carlos. He works in South America. He does research. He works with governments to try to improve prison conditions. There's lots of crim research on that, and yet he doesn't have access to that research because he's not associated with the university. And as an independent NGO worker, he's not able to afford subscriptions to 100+ journals. Finally, think about someone like Lindsay. Lindsay's a captain in a big city police department. She wants to make sure that her officers are behaving in a procedurally just way, and she wants to know what can be done to make sure that her officers are promoting good community relations. There's loads of research on that, and she can't see any of it because it's all in journals. And when any of these people go to a journal website, this is what they see. This is from Criminology, ASC's flagship journal, and you can see there that if you want a PDF of a single article in Criminology, not for a year's worth of articles, or not even for an issue, a single article in Criminology is $49 to get a PDF of. And Priya and Juan Carlos and Lindsay cannot afford that, particularly because all they can see is the abstract at the point where they have to pay, and it might be that the article is not useful afterwards, so they're very unlikely to sort of take the chance of paying $50 before they even know what the article says. Now, there is an answer to this, and that answer is open access publishing, and it's been around for ages. If you're not aware of it, what it means is that you release your research in such a way that other people can read, download, copy, distribute, print, search, and do anything they like with that PDF or that work, as long as they comply with any legal requirements, and that normally means a requirement to acknowledge the source of the information. So this is the answer to people not being able to access research, so the question is, are we making use of that answer? Are we, as a discipline, making sure our research gets out there? So what I did, I took 97 criminology journals, looked at all of the articles that they published in the 3 years, 2017 to 2019, and then put all of those through a service called unpaywall.org. And what unpaywall.org does is it categorizes articles into 4 groups. So green articles are articles where the author has put a version, typically the version that they submitted to the journal originally, online for free. Gold articles are those where the author, or often their university, have paid for the publisher to remove the paywall around that article so that anybody can see it without subscribing. Bronze articles are those where the publisher has removed the paywall, and they sometimes do that if an article is particularly topical. So lots of COVID-related research is not currently paywalled, and so you can see it under bronze open access. And then closed articles that you can only access if you've got a subscription to the journal. Now, fortunately, a research team has looked at the question of how often are authors making their work available open access across other disciplines. Now, this didn't include criminology, but they did look at other disciplines, and that means that we can use their results as a benchmark of what proportion of articles we would expect to be available to practitioners, to people in the global south, and so on, compared to other disciplines. So criminology, we're a discipline where a lot of people come into this area of research because they want to make a difference to practice, because they want to make a difference to policy, because they want to make to have their work to have an effect in the real world outside academia. And that might not always be true of some of the other disciplines that were studied by Pivovar et al. So how do we compare to other disciplines? Well, we're much, much worse. So compared to other disciplines, about half their research is open. With criminology, it's less than a quarter. And it's particularly bad in some places. So if we look at just the top 20 journals in criminology, then we'll see that a lot of them, it's even worse than the average. Now, criminology, the journal, the ASC's flagship journal, actually does relatively well here. But if one journal I want to highlight is Criminology and Public Policy, a journal which exists solely for the purpose of translating research and making it useful to policymakers, and yet almost 90% of articles in that journal are not accessible to anyone that doesn't have a subscription. And a small number of policymakers, particularly in central governments, may have subscriptions. But if you're someone like Lindsay, or you're someone in a state government or a local government elsewhere, it's often the case that you're not going to have that. And that's a big challenge if you're trying to get research into public hands. Next thing to say is that researchers in the United States are particularly bad at this. That's a big problem because most criminological papers come from authors in the US. And so the global average was about 3/4 were closed. In the US, it's just under 90%. Now, at the other end of that scale, you've got the UK and the Netherlands, and both of their governments have quite strong programs to encourage open access. They do it in different ways, which is why the green and the gold bars are different sizes for those two. But the lack of open access among US academics is a real challenge because most criminologists or most criminologists who publish in journals are working in the US. And yet, you almost certainly have the right to release a version of your papers online for anyone to read completely free. And doing this is really important because of those people who don't have access to it otherwise. How do you do that? I wrote a guide earlier in the year that you can get to from that URL, bit.ly/stop-hiding-research. So next time you're publishing, think of these people. Take 15 minutes, which is probably about how long it'll take to make your article open access by posting it online on your university website, personal website, an institutional repository. All the details are back on that bit.ly link that I mentioned before. So these slides are available online if you want access to them. The full paper that is open access, the data that I use to do this and the code I use to do the analysis are also available online. And then if you've got any questions, I'm very happy to answer them in the Q&A session at the end, or by email or on Twitter. But thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much. It's a incredibly important topic, both yours and Chris's today. We have a few questions. We've got a little bit of time to answer questions. We got a question here for Chris. What leads you to say that this field is especially uncertain? Coming from the outside, it appears to me that there is actually quite a bit of consensus on some major questions, more so than in many other areas of social science.
So I guess I'd say a couple of points about what uncertainty means here. And so we're talking about like epistemic uncertainty, which is a bit of uncertainty about kind of what there is out there, sort of what, you know, the unknown things that are potentially knowable. What I'd say is uncertain is several things. So if we're talking about the things where people have a more settled perspective on, you know, things that work, like what, you know, hotspots policing, problem-oriented policing, focused deterrence, procedural justice. A few things sort of come out, and this is nothing for, this is not a knock on the science that's been done. It's just that, you know, even when we talk about hotspots policing, we know only a limited amount about the ingredients in successful hotspots policing interventions. So we have uncertainty about the ingredients, like what was actually done in the hotspot. We have uncertainty about how what was done there might translate to a new context. We have uncertainty about the probability for success of doing that in a new context. And this differs from, if you think about like medical sciences or even psychology, you might have proportions that you could start to translate across at least similar cultural contexts. So your odds of success or the odds that a treatment or an intervention would work. It just doesn't make sense when you take it, when your sort of patient is a city or a neighborhood in that sense. And you know, you still even, and when we talk about the context stuff, even, you know, relatively settled questions like focused deterrence or procedural justice, where there's very good evidence about that it sort of does something. When you start taking it in a new context, there's a book released last year about looking at procedural justice in places like Japan and Norway and several African countries, Ghana, South Africa. And it just, the scaling properties aren't the same. You know, the things people value in terms of justice and fairness differ. When you look at sort of settled criminological questions like the age crime curve, that doesn't hold outside of Western kind of liberal democracies. You know, so a lot of these settled questions are actually relatively uncertain, but even where there's good evidence that it's a reasonably good idea, the ingredients that we're used to get, what is problem-oriented policing, right? So what exactly does that mean? and to say we're going to do a problem-oriented policing intervention, it doesn't have the ingredients on it the way, say, a pharmaceutical intervention would. And so I think those are where we see the uncertainty. Hopefully that makes sense. I think you're muted, Troy.
That's the first time that I've done that during this conference, so that's it was bound to happen eventually. We got a couple questions for Matt, and I think they're related. What funding structures exist in the UK to promote open access? And what advice do you have about ensuring that research is not just available, but it also gets into the right people's hands?
So, okay. So the question about funding, in the UK, we have, if your research is funded by one of the big research funding organizations, then they typically give a block grant to your university to give you, to allow you to make your article gold open access, i.e. to pay the publisher to remove the paywall for that article. But some of the bigger, better funded universities have their own funds, although they sometimes run out during the year. But I think we should be much more focused on green open access because it doesn't cost anything. There's lots of other advantages to green open access, which I talk about in the paper that I've linked to on the chat. But green is I think the way forward, and it's one of the main reasons for that is that it's free. In terms of the importance of getting of not just making research available, but also getting it into the right people's hands. I've started now referring to people to a really good blog post written by John Swabish at the Urban Institute, I think, that I'll link to again in the chat, which talks about a sort of layered pyramid of communication techniques where you do very simple communications for a mass audience and then slightly less simple for a slightly smaller audience until you get down to your journal article, which is very detailed but has a much smaller audience. But the point is that each layer rests on the one below, because if there's someone sees your tweet and wants more information or doesn't trust you, which is fine, and so, well, where did you get your data from? What analysis did you do? They just move down to the next layer and down and down and down. The other people who are happy with an answer, a simpler answer, stay at that level. There's also a third question about that I'll go, if that's okay, where it's somebody who's saying that isn't opening up academics papers only part of the problem. That's absolutely true. You need just making your stuff open access isn't enough. There are lots of other things that people can do, and I would say should do. You can make short videos of your work to publish it. I've recorded my session today, and I can then post that and use that as a video for anyone that's interested. You could tweet summaries of it. You can speak at practitioner-focused conferences. I do that quite a lot. I'm almost always the only academic there. With a few exceptions. Go to I'm interested in policing. Go to conferences with police officers. Talk to police officers. But one thing that person does say at the end is, of the three people you described, only the PhD student is likely to have access. Is likely to be able to read a journal paper, and I don't think that's true. We have particularly the police captain archetype. There are lots of people in policing now who have advanced degrees. We have a lot of police officers in the UK with empirically focused master's degrees who are quite capable of ingesting and making use of academic papers. That they are a minority, but there are plenty of them out there. And so I wouldn't. Hey, if I put it out there and no one reads it, I've lost 10 minutes of my time. But if I don't put it out there and even 5 people around the world did want to read a paper and then they can't, then they've lost more. And really so have I, because if I'm not doing research for people to make use of, then why am I doing it?
Yeah, and I just to tag on to that, because I think it comes into the the dashboard conversation too, right? So even if you have a relatively complex model, you can visualize the results from that model in a dashboard. So you could have users be able to choose different ideal cases. Like if you're looking at officer discretion and you've got, situational characteristics and characteristics of the officers and the citizens, you can have people play with that and look at predicted results. So instead of a table of regression coefficients, you can have a chart that's readily understandable by most people. Now, some folks are going to want to see the model and they want to know the details behind the data. And that's like, us, right? Academics. But a fair few people just want to know, well, what does this mean? Like I don't really care about how the model was run. Tell me how these officers are different from those officers. And I think it's the question of, will people read criminology and criminal justice research? I think it's, will we talk to practitioners? And Matthew really hit on that hard. And I think that's a lot of the problem. It's certainly something that I've found since coming into the Alaska Justice Information Center, is just how much work we have to do to talk to practitioners, not only at their level, like sort of talking down to them, but speaking to questions that they have that are actionable to them. It's both of those things. I do want to answer a couple of questions about tech stuff, and for folks who have more questions about the technical end of dashboards, I'm happy to have conversations. Got a question here about what software do I recommend for creating public-facing dashboards? My answer to that is that there's not one answer. If you're heavily invested in R, for example, R Shiny is a good way to go. We did not do that for a couple of reasons. One, we're not heavily invested in R. And another reason is that we can't inject custom code into our university's content management system. So even if I created a super fancy, amazing dashboard in Shiny or in some other app, I can't get it into my university's website. And so we were in a position where we were going to have to run some independent thing anyway. That's a large part of the reason why we went with Tableau. It's not necessarily that Tableau is the best tool, it's that the mix of features was right for us and our circumstances. So if you want to figure out what software that you want to start investing in, if you're training graduate students or you're training staff or you're training yourself, you really need to do a needs assessment and figure out what are your functional requirements, what do you need to be able to do, and what exists in tools right now to get it done. There's just not a single answer that works for every shop. There's another question, how much manpower does it take to maintain data pipelines? That is a great question. That is dependent on the particular project. So that DOC population dashboard takes a couple of hours of work from one of our analysts a month. Most of that time is spent in data cleaning. We have everything set up so that once the data is cleaned, it can be injected into the dashboard fairly easily. But that question gets to the software development lifecycle, which if you're unfamiliar, if you're not from IT, not from a programming background, Google software development lifecycle, you'll see a couple of different ways that that's been articulated, but you have to plan, design, implement, and maintain these sorts of systems. For some systems, the maintenance cost is zero. It's a one and done kind of project. And for others, like our population dashboard, we have ongoing maintenance costs in terms of time each month. So it's project specific. Unfortunately, there aren't super satisfying answers to either one of those questions, but I wanted to address them here. If you have questions about the specifics of any of our authors' talks today, get in touch. I think we're all pretty easily findable, and our contact information was on the slides. That is the end of our time. Unfortunately, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of our questions. This session has been recorded by CrimCon. We're going to post it to YouTube in the coming weeks. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel to get notifications when we start posting videos from this. You can also subscribe to our mailing list at crimcon.org. Towards the bottom, there's a subscription field there where you can subscribe. We will let everybody know when those are ready. For folks who are hanging out in this webinar for the next session, we're going to end this session and you'll have to rejoin. There are boring technical reasons why we're doing that, but just to let you know, we're about to kick you out. Thanks so much to our panelists. This has been a very interesting conversation.
Thanks so much for everyone for attending, and do send any questions through on email or Twitter as you wish. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Troy, Matt.
Thanks. All right, we're going to end this session and folks will have to rejoin for the next session.